Initiation by Robert Hugh Benson. Part 2. Chapter 5, Part 1. Subsection 1. Aunt Anna sat in the pavilion waiting for her letters, but uncharacteristically she was doing nothing at all. A couple of papers, brought by the local grocer, rested unopened on the round table. She herself sat in the window seat with her feet up, leaning back against a couple of cushions. Her hands lay in her lap. Her grey eyes wandered vaguely out upon the river below the windows and the park beyond. It was a hot, breathless noon. All across the green spaces not a creature appeared. The cattle were under the beeches on one side, and the deer under the elms on the other. Now and again a faint movement in the shadow showed a head tossed against the swarming flies. The very water itself seemed depressed and flat, as if all the sting and effervescence were drawn out of it by the steady blaze of light that showed 3 feet behind the dark running streamers of weed and the pebbly patches of bottom. The birds were still. A single pigeon cooed far away and suddenly left off, as if the effort were too great. Through the door on the left she could see across the lawn where a single butterfly flickered against the green, the great house drowsing with all its eyes half closed by the lids of the sunblinds. She had even had the awnings put up outside the pavilion windows. Yet, though the day was one of peace and sleepiness, she was neither peaceful nor sleepy. There was a curious, undefined sense of apprehensiveness in her whole being. It had increased steadily and slowly through the last day or two. At first she had put it down, with her usual good sense, to nerves overstrained by the succession of hot days, and then to her own peculiar position and Neville's absence under these circumstances. But her attempts at reassurance were not successful, and she had begun to perceive, as imaginative and rather superstitious people will perceive, small, significant happenings about her that appeared full of omen. She knew perfectly well that she was superstitious, and that she had no right to be so. She had sternly put away these fancies, but they had returned. Just now she had relaxed her efforts and was reviewing the little list. She became absurdly superstitious at such times. For example, if she were desiring some event very keenly, she would take omens, as she said, almost continuously. If 2 flies crawling on the floor in a patch of sunlight, the one that looked the browner reached the shadow first, then the event would happen. If the other, then it would not. If, when the Angelus bell rang, she could say the salutation twice before the last of the 9 strokes, then she would succeed in some little undertaking. If she could not, she would fail. Once or twice she had spoken of this habit of mind. Once she had defended it with a kind of humorous agnosticism to Neville. "We live under a very large number of laws," she had said, "about which we know nothing at all, and all these laws are interconnected like the strands of a net. Why shouldn't there be some real relation between them? Why shouldn't 2 flies crawling on the floor be a real symbol of something that's happening somewhere else? Besides, I tell you, it does come true. I don't mean every omen is infallible, but that a great number of them do show a general tendency." "I'm surprised at you, Aunt Anna," Neville has solemnly answered. "Just you tell Father Richardson and see what he says." "I shouldn't dream of it," she said defiantly. "It isn't a sin." "Yes, it is. It's in the Catechism." "Bosh," said Aunt Anna. "Besides, I'd always sooner believe too much than too little. I heard a priest say the other day that superstition was a byproduct of faith." "No, he didn't. He said it was a waste product, because I was with you. I remember it perfectly." "Well, it's a product, anyhow," said Aunt Anna. "And you shouldn't waste anything. It's all useful, if you know how to use it, like a pig's bristles." Subsection 2. She was thinking of this now, because all her omens were being taken on the subject of Neville, and it was these that she was reviewing. Really, her defensive omen-taking had something to be said for it. There was first the apprehensiveness in general. Neville had been gone for exactly 11 days, because this was Monday, and he had gone on the Thursday week before. Well, the apprehensiveness had begun on Saturday. She had awakened with it. At any rate, she had been conscious of it as she had hurried back from Mass to see if there were any news from him. But there was none. She had heard only 2 days before, and it was not likely that he would write again so soon. Neither had there been any letter on Sunday, nor, so far, on Monday. His last, Thursday's, letter had been one bubbling joy. He had written about Lord Maresfield, among other things, and had said that they were all going to the opera together that evening, and that they were to meet on Saturday Madame Selver at the Hotel Cecil. He had in an earlier letter described the play they had been to on his first night in London, and the Academy. He had also said that the lawyers had things in hand, and had of course raved about Enid. There had been, therefore, no justification at all for her apprehensiveness. Everything was going perfectly well. She would certainly have heard if there had been any law difficulty. Algy Lennox was there too, and Neville was apparently seeing a good deal of him. That was all excellent. Algy, in spite of his tiresomeness about tennis, was a sane and pleasant companion. Neville had dined out, too, once or twice, as well as with the Bessingtons. He was going to Ranelagh. He seemed as prosperous as possible. Yet there the apprehensiveness had been, and here it was still. She had taken a perfect torrent of omens all the rest of Saturday and Sunday. She had even caught herself betting, so to speak, at low Mass, as to whether the server would get back from the credence table before he began the Suscipiat. If he did, then things would go well with Neville. If not, not. He had not. He had begun on the second step on his way home. And nearly all the other omens had gone wrong too. A stag had come out from the shade on Sunday afternoon, exactly when she finally settled that he must not. Jim had cried aloud, "Mummy!" when she was expecting him to come, but had not finished counting the 100 which he had set as the point before which he must not call Mummy if things were to go well with Neville. Yes, the apprehensiveness and superstition were certainly in full blast. She was not quite sure as to what she meant by things going well with Neville. She had assimilated Mr. Morpeth's cheerful optimism sufficiently to accept the fact that if Neville must marry Enid, he must marry Enid. But she was not quite certain yet that he must marry her. Things going well represented, then, a rather vague ideal. To be frank, it meant to Aunt Anna that God's will should really be done and that it should make for Neville's happiness. It was no more defined than that, when she tried to fix it. But these voluntary omens were not the worst. The weight on her mind seemed to rise, rather, from a number of little external things that happened, quite apart from her deliberate volition. First, her tremors had come on her once again, in the presence of the corniced door at the top of the stairs. She had come in from late Mass yesterday by the front door instead of through the gardens, because she had wanted to see whether it were blistering, as Masterson had told her. And, as she entered, in the broad sunlight, a minute or two after noon, under the most prosaic and least suggestive of circumstances, she had been completely certain that there was someone waiting for her there. There was a tall porter's chair beyond the table, with its back to her, and, so assured was she that someone was there, perhaps Mr. Morpeth, or a friend from a neighbour's house, that she walked quickly round to the hearth. The chair was empty, and she looked round, a little puzzled, only realizing then that her thought had been unjustified, yet wondering whether perhaps her visitor were not elsewhere. She had raised her eyes to the gallery, and, as they fell upon the door, she understood that her absurd fear of it had come on her again. This would never do. She rang the bell. "Masterson," she said, "I want the key of the west bedroom. Would you ask Mrs. Templemore whether she has it?" She had not been in the bedroom for several months. It had been cleaned and looked after, she supposed, as usual. She waited until Masterson came back with it, and then a thought struck her. Certainly she must face the room. But the facing of it alone in the dark? For the shutters were closed and the curtains, she supposed, drawn. was a little too much for her resolution. "Just go up and undo the shutters, will you?" The butler went up first and unlocked the door. She heard his feet on the polished boards and followed him. As she came to the threshold, a great bar clanged within, and he was pulling back one side of the shutters as she entered. "I think I'll have both," she said. When he finished opening that window and was dealing with the next, she stood irresolute, looking about her. The great bed rose like a monstrous catafalque, with the curtains drawn so as to enclose it all round. The tables and sofa and chairs, she saw, were all as she remembered them. The washing place was empty of towels and linens, and a sponging tin stood in one corner. "Thanks," she said. "That's all. I'll bring the key down when I come. Close the door, please." She felt she must add this. Really, she must face the thing properly. It was just a big, solemn, old-fashioned bedroom. There was a good though worn carpet on the floor. The furniture was mahogany and chintz covered chiefly with dust sheets. There was a door beside the bed on the far side that communicated with the bathroom, beyond which again was Neville's room. She saw the key was in the door on this side. She felt tremulous but determined. She told herself she had been silly not to have been here before. It was simply its associations that haunted her. It was here that the end of the tragedy had come. There, beyond those enshrouding curtains. On the side nearest the gallery, Neville had sat, holding his father's hand. It was to that side that the fierce, defiant, bandaged head with blazing, sunken eyes had leaned to whisper. It was on that side that it had fallen, at last, deathly still and no longer defiant. Well, she must pull the curtains and look into the bed. She went towards it resolutely. If she hesitated, her nerves might snap. She took hold of the curtains nearer the bathroom door and drew them back, and for one sickening instant her heart stood still, for there appeared to be lying within the bed a stiff, sheeted figure. Then, with set teeth, she tore back the sheet and disclosed a rolled mattress. She came out through the bathroom, and there were the familiar signs of occupation. The big wooden bowl of yellow soap, the stiff bath brush, the exercise machine hanging on the wall, even a pair of grass slippers. She went on through Neville's room. The bed was stripped, which looked dreary, but all else was as it should be, except that there were no mysterious garments and dressing gowns hanging on the tall-hung pegs. Well, there it was. There had been nothing there. There could be nothing. Yet she did not feel in the least reassured. As she stood in the hall again, exactly the same sense of a burdensome and sinister presence lay on her, and the door was ominous. She had not exorcised her ghost. It was a relief when Jim came bursting in from the garden with the collies. The second unpleasant little happening was even more unreasonably disconcerting. It was connected with Jim himself. She had taken him to afternoon benediction at 4 o'clock on the same day, and as they came out, their path to the gardens lay beside the Fanning grave, where old Sir Neville had been carried down from the bedroom she had visited that morning. Never before, so far as she remembered, had Jim referred to this place, after he had first been told what it was, and the inscription on top of the flat altar tomb within the railings been read to him. This time, however, he stopped dead. "Mummy," he said. "Yes?" "That's where Uncle Neville is buried, isn't it?" "Yes, they're all buried there," she said. "Come on, my boy, don't loiter." "Oh," said Jim, still not moving, and regarding the tomb with solemn eyes. "And I suppose Cousin Neville will be buried there too?" A faint sickness laid its hand on her heart. Yet it was just the kind of thing that Jim did suddenly say without any context at all. "Yes, my dear," she said softly. "And so will you, perhaps. And I too." "Oh, is it a big room down there?" She felt a violent desire to tell him to hold his tongue and come away. But it would scarcely be decent in a Catholic mother to avoid such things when her son questioned her. as he put his inquiry, she remembered the room, as he called it, as she had seen it when it had been opened to receive first her husband's body and then his brother's, a narrow, dark chamber with niches on either side. "No, my dear, it's not a big room. It's quite little, but it's much better to think about their souls." "Oh, I know all about that," said Jim, with a touch of contempt. "I want to know about their bodies. Do they very soon—" "Jim, I'm not going to go on." "Well, the bodies go back to the dust again, but their souls are quite somewhere else." "Yes, I know, Mummy, but I want to know whether the bodies—" "There's Mr. Morpeth," she said. "Run and ask him to come and speak to me." Well, again, that was all. But why in the world, on that day of all days, when she had been into the west bedroom, should Jim be so greedy of knowledge as to the processes of the grave? Here then, in the pavilion on this Monday morning, she sat and meditated. Jim was out riding with the dogs and wouldn't be back till lunch. She meditated upon her apprehensiveness and her omens. She told herself several times not to be foolish and morbid. She longed for the letters. Then at last they came, and once more it was Masterson who brought them. "Letter from Sir Neville, ma'am," he said, just as he had said before. And she too, just as before, tore open the envelope first of all and glanced through it. "He doesn't say he's altered his plans, Masterson," she said, scarcely even thinking it strange this time that a servant should be so intimate. She understood better now how the old man loved his master. "And Father Richardson's here, ma'am. Could he speak to you, he says." Subsection 3. While Father Richardson talked of some small parochial matters, her mind was still working. She was perfectly certain that, humanly speaking, he would not understand one thing about her tremors, but, after all, he was a priest as well. She still hesitated, however, up to the very moment when he stood up to go, and then took her decision swiftly. "Can you spare a few minutes, Father?" she said. "I want to consult you about something." The priest sat down again. "I expect you'll think it very foolish of me," she said, but I'm in what they call a state of mind." She smiled rather piteously. "I've got no sort of reason for it, but I feel anxious, and I don't even know what I'm anxious about." "Oh, just nerves," said the priest reassuringly and sensibly. "Yes, that's what I say to myself, Father, but it doesn't comfort me. It's about my nephew, of course. I keep on imagining things." "What kind of things?" said Father Richardson prudently. "That's just what I don't know. Oh, that he's going to have some misfortune, I suppose, or get ill, or die, or be disappointed. Everything seems to point that way, and—" She stopped suddenly. "I don't understand quite," said the priest. "I should have thought that his engagement and his state of health were all most satisfactory. Of course, it's a pity Miss Bessington is not a Catholic, but I have the dispensation all right, and I'm sure that she's a most exceptional—" "Oh, it's not that a bit," she said. "I don't mean in that kind of way. I don't know what I mean." Father Richardson said most politely and sympathetically that, really, he did not, either. "Well, don't you know that sort of feeling one has that everything is going wrong? It's like a cloud. It hangs over everything and depresses one horribly, and one can't put it away." Father Richardson assured her again that he did not know what she meant, unless she referred, he put it quite gently, unless she referred to indigestion. Then she saw that it was hopeless. It seemed to her odd that a priest should be so very materialistic about everything. She thanked her own instincts that she had not referred to omens. "Well, I dare say you're right," she said, with an effort. "Thanks very much, Father. I expect you're quite right." There was a footstep on the gravel, and again Masterson stood on the steps of the pavilion. "Beg pardon, ma'am," Mr. Morpeth is here." "Oh yes, ask him to come out." The butler retired. "There was nothing else, Mrs. Fanning?" asked the priest with an air of having completely justified his role of spiritual physician. "No, nothing else, Father. I expect it's better not to speak of those things, isn't it? Good morning, Father. Thank you so much. Sir Neville will be down before the end of next week, I expect. But I'll still let you know for certain, as soon as I can, whether he'll be here for the concert." Father Richardson thanked her and bade her good morning. He felt quite pleased at having been consulted, and at having dealt so adequately and reassuringly with her questions. What queer, fanciful people women were! By the time that Mr. Morpeth's solid form was seen advancing across the lawn, she had taken up Neville's letter again. Again, the others were unopened. And once more she determined to speak to this layman frankly. Even she, who had begun to know him so well, had been astonished at the perfect composure with which he had taken his daughter's death. She might have expected that, for a day or two, or even a week, he would have kept up his resolution, but it was more than a month now since the girl had been buried. She herself had spoken with him again and again. She had sat in his garden one afternoon, and he had talked of his daughter exactly as if she were just on a short visit away from home. Never yet had he shown even an effort not to falter or to give way. He took off his hat gravely and replaced it again, as he came up to the steps. Then again he took it off as he sat down and drew out his handkerchief. "I just called about the concert," he said. "Father Richardson has sent me no notice of it. I think he thinks I should not come to it so soon after my daughter's death. Most kind and tactful of him, but I do not feel in the least like that myself. I only wondered what the people would think if I came. Will you kindly advise me, Mrs. Fanning? I would not shock them for the world." I think they might not quite understand it," she said. He inclined his head gravely. "Thank you. That is sufficient." He fumbled a moment in the pocket of his waistcoat. Then he drew out a small, flat object and laid it on the table. "Then will you do me one more kindness?" he said. "There is a sovereign in that paper. Would you kindly purchase 4 tickets on my behalf, and distribute them to whomsoever you please?" "That is kind of you. I will do it most gladly." "Thank you," he said. Then he took up his hat as if to go. "No, stay, Mr. Morpeth, and I want to consult you about something." He replaced his hat on the table.